So I've had this Yamaha FZ1 for a bit over a year now, in fact getting on for 18 months, and I actually traded up to this bike from a Kawasaki Versys 650. Which in terms of poke was quite an upgrade. Now I bought this bike for almost exactly 4,000 euros with 33,000 kilometers on the clock, and when I bought it, it was completely stock. No aftermarket parts whatsoever. And obviously, as everybody does, I've bolted some new stuff on, I've changed some stuff out, so I think in order to give this video a little bit of context, it probably makes sense if we pull up, have a little look at all of the stuff that I've done to this bike. But not before we take what looks to be the shortest ferry crossing on the smallest ferry in all of Hamburger land. Look at that. Look at a front seat. And I'm not allowed to get off the bike apparently. And we're off. I've just realised actually as well, we're not in Hamburger land at all. We're in Schleswig-Holstein right now, which is north of Hamburg. There we go. Completely free as well. Der beste Preis, kostenlos. It feels like we're in a different country all of a sudden. There's something deeply exciting about rolling off of a ferry on a motorbike, isn't there? So as I was saying, let's find a nice little spot to pull up, have a little bit of a walk around of the bike. Oh, I think this ought to do it. That should do very nicely. So there she is. This is a 2006 Yamaha FZ1N. The N obviously denoting the naked aspect of the bike because there's no fairing on the front. As I said, when I bought it, it was completely stock. Since then, I have added, starting from the front and the things that you can see, there's the Air Max windscreen. Peeking through between the forks there are the stainless steel braided brake lines. I've got twin horns with their twin horn sound. We've got a pair of Kellerman Micro Rhombus PL LED indicators and positioning lights, real carbon fibre headlight mount panels from F&F Carbon, along with radiator fairing panel and tank fairing, also from F&F Carbon. Coming over to the cockpit area, I've got V-Trek Shorty aluminium brake lever and clutch lever set, pair of high-sider bar end mirrors, Oxford heated grips, the Heeltech GI Pro X-Type G2 gear indicator, a bunch of RAM ball mount thingies onto which I've mounted a camera, and also my Ultimate add-ons phone case. Coming down to the side here, we've got the SW Motec engine crash bars, along with nestling under here the SW Motec center stand. We've got a pair of LSL aluminium foot pegs, which actually don't vibrate at all because this whole foot peg mount is actually rubber mounted. Now, those of you who have been paying attention to the channel, I did have adjustable LSL foot peg mounts here, but I found the extra width of the adjustment mechanism was just making everything far too uncomfortable because my feet were too far out and I had to point my toes in to get to the controls. So I've taken a step back. I've still got the LSL foot pegs, which give me a bit more ground clearance and also a bit more leg room, but they are in the standard position. Moving further around, oh, I almost forgot. The petrol tank is covered in carbon fibre vinyl wrap. I've got plans to change this for a brushed steel look because I now think that the real carbon against the fake carbon creates a bit of an odd look. The seat is actually completely standard. This is just a cover from Top Celery, which I bought cheap on eBay, so nothing special there. The exhaust pipe that I'm running at the moment is the Speed Products Cobra SPX, which sounds absolutely fantastic when you open the taps on this thing, and if you ask me, it also looks pretty cool as well. It's small, it's subtle, but the sound is everything but. The back end here, I've got Kellerman tail tidy along with another pair of Kellerman Micro Rhombus LED indicators and brake lights. These are the Dark DF model. I've got a pair of paddock stand bobbins on the back, which I put on before I got the center stand, and I've just left them there as a bit of frame protection should the bike end up on its side. And also hiding under there, and the real gubbins is nestling over here somewhere, I've got a Scott oiler keeping the chain and the sprockets in good order. Further round, and I've stuck an eBay special, cheap and nasty, Chinese aluminium side stand foot on there, which helps in situations like this when the ground is a bit loose, just to give it a bit of surface area on the side stand so the bike doesn't tip over. Oh, and I've also got down here a real carbon fibre fender extender, which again I bought from eBay. And of course, all of these things, if there's a video to the installation, there'll be a link in the description, and also where possible links for you to find out where you can get some yourself. Oh, and last but very much not least, on the top here I've got the SW Motec Quick Lock Evo tank ring. which works with my 2 tank bags that I got from SW Motec, and I think the system is fantastic. Oh, and also, staring me in the face, very nearly forgot, I've very recently put a nice new set of wider ABM Superbike handlebars on the bike, which I think have improved the comfort of the cockpit and also the control of the steering quite drastically. So other than the things you can see, what else have I changed that you can't see? Well, I fitted to this bike, and actually you can almost see a little part of it nestled in just here. A Heel-Tech quick shifter, which I've been finding is absolutely brilliant. There's something deeply satisfying about just keeping the throttle pinned and then smashing through the gearbox all the way to the top and into license unfriendly territory. Under here I've fitted a BMC air filter. I've got a booster plug fitted. So yeah, as far as I know, that is just about everything. So there's no hugely drastic improvements or changes made to the bike. A lot of the stuff is mainly cosmetic, but now that you know what we're looking at, let's get back on the road and talk about how I feel about it. So I guess the question is, how do I feel about it? Well, I'm going to have to be honest. Hashtag spoiler alert, I really, really like this bike. I mean, for the obvious reason that going from a 650 to 1000 was a massive upgrade in speed and power, but also coming from a thumpy twin, the 998cc inline-4 engine in this bike, which is out of the R1, which was around at the same time as this bike was created, is also a huge upgrade in terms of vibrations. This bike is buttery smooth. That being said, since I put these new bars on, I am noticing a little bit more vibration, but I think that's got something to do with the fact that I used to have great big heavy steel bar ends and I've replaced them with these rubbish little aluminium ones. That was a real mistake, so I think they'll be getting swapped for something heavier. So yeah, power, vibrations, both hugely upgraded. Noise, well, with this SPX silencer from Cobra, that is an undisputable upgrade. Although I do have to say, when the bike was stock with the stock can on it, the sound wasn't awful. I mean, the can weighed more than a small battleship, but that's another matter. And then we come on to probably what's the most important feature of all, fuel economy. No, I'm only kidding. Of course I mean handling. And I think the handling is utterly fantastic. It's razor sharp with just a little bit of forgiveness for the odd mistake and a bit of clumsy ham-fisted corner chuckery, which I am a strong advocate of. The suspension for my level of expertise seems to be more than adequate. I've done a little bit of fiddling with the settings to try and make it as good as possible, and it seems to be working for me. I've heard of people saying that the FZ1 rear shock is a bit stiff and a bit heavily sprung, but seeing as I weigh just shy of 100 kilos, that's kind of perfect for me. And it seems to work. I've never noticed any real rear end chattering or wallowing or any problems that you would normally get at either end of the spectrum with a crap suspension setup. But in terms of flickability, I have had nothing but a good experience with this bike so far. When I was in the Alps last year with Smoky Bar, I think we were both quite impressed by how quickly this bike can change direction. I mean, obviously being helped along by the taller profile of the 190/55/17 on the back from Michelin, which helps to raise the back end of the bike up a little bit, alter the geometry, and ultimately speed up the steering a little. But yeah, despite having a vastly larger turning circle than the XJ6N that Smoky Bar was on, I had absolutely no problems bunging this into really tight hairpins, and furthermore feeling confident and excited while I was doing it. Handling wise, this bike in the mountains was an absolute gem. And although I haven't really found any super twisties yet, I am finding that with the wider bars, I've got even more confidence and even more control of the flickability nasticity of the bike. Note to self, email Oxford Dictionary, insert flickable nasticity. Well, that's the point. I haven't talked about the brakes. They are very, very good. Because when this bike was made, they pretty much just delved into the parts bin, took the same brake setup from the R1, smashed it onto this bike, so it's no real surprise that the brakes do a fine job of stopping the bike up. And of course, without any interference from ABS. I mean, I know there is a very strong argument that ABS is the sensible way to go, but so far, even after riding and even after emergency stopping in the rain in the Black Forest, I haven't felt like the ABS has been something I've missed. And it also made my braided brake line upgrade far cheaper because I only had to worry about 2 hoses, bosh, fitted. There was no going back to the ABS pump, there was no issues with pressure testing, there was no issues with bleeding the system out. It was a quick and it was a cheap upgrade. And I'm also loving the way it feels. Good firm feedback on the lever, far more of a feeling of being connected to the wheel at the front when I start to do the braking. Which brings us on to probably the first of a few negatives that I've experienced with this bike. The fueling is absolute toss. It really is terrible. I mean, it has the typical snatchy low end that most electric fuel injected bikes have, caused by lean fueling in order to get through emissions tests. And to a certain degree, I've smoothed that out by using the booster plug, and also since I put in this BMC air filter, the roll-on, roll-off seems to be a little bit more responsive, but at the same time a little bit softer edged. But further to that issue, Yamaha seem to feel the need to program into their bikes a thing which is being called the deceleration cut, or in German, this is a great word, Schubabschaltung. And what that does is if you shut the throttle with the engine spinning at over 4,500 RPM, it shuts off the injectors completely. Now, whereas this does, of course, minutely improve fuel economy and reduce emissions, what it also causes is a situation where the cylinders, the pistons, the pipes, the injectors, everything goes completely dry because it's not getting any fuel anymore. So then when you eventually come back on the throttle, there's this little bit of a delay as the fuel comes through the system and wets everything up again before you can get an explosion. Hey what, instead of just nattering about it, I'm going to go and try and find somewhere where I can show it to you. Oh, here we go, here's some bends. So this first corner, I'm below 4,000 RPM, I'm off the throttle. When I come onto the throttle, it's relatively soft. It wasn't perfect, but it was there. So as I come up to this sweeping left-hand bend, I've got quite high revs. If I back off the throttle, and then come back on again, I'm on the throttle, nothing, and then it kicks. There again, off the throttle, I come back on, nothing, and then I get a jerk. And not a good kind. Very, very annoying. And it seems the only thing you can really do to get rid of that is to reflash your ECU. So yeah, that's the fueling. Not the best, though I am half happy and also half sad to say. The newer Yamahas, it seems, are almost as bad. They've made very little progress in the way of smoothing out the fueling in the Yamaha camp. Suzuki have done a bit of a better job. From what I remember from Triumph, they were almost spot on. But the MT10 that I rode just a couple of weeks ago, it was probably 60% as snatchy as this is, and this bike is 13 years older. So you do the math. Is that 40% reduction in snatchiness worth the extra? Well, 12 grand. That's how much that bike cost over this one. You do of course get all the toys and ABS and all that kind of stuff, which obviously I don't have. So anyway, fueling out of the way, what about the comfort? Well, before I changed the bars, I have to say the comfort wasn't too bad. I did notice at the end of the longer rides in Switzerland that my wrists and my shoulders were getting a little bit sore because the bars were quite low, quite narrow. So although it wasn't sports bike bad, I was putting a little bit more pressure on my wrists than I remembered doing on the Versys. But of course the Versys was a very different style of bike. However, since I've put these bars on, I've been riding for a couple of hours today now, and my elbows feel fine, my shoulders feel fine, my wrists feel fine. Everything seems to be very natural, very comfortable. And also, because I'm not bending over quite so much to the bars, a lot less tiredness and achiness in my old spine as well. So I recommended upgrade on the FZ1, I'd say. Other than that, the seat, give it its due, it's 13 years old, it's had 13 years of being trampled by various arses, not too many I hope my bike isn't that much of a whore, but it's still not the best. It slopes forward into the tank, which on the longer rides either causes a bit of fatigue in your legs and your knees because you're forcing your weight back or you're squeezing your legs on the tank. Also, it's not the most comfortable. It's quite firm, sadly without being very supportive. A few times in the first few months of having the bike I got some real sore ass moments. Just pressure points where your hips push through your arse meat onto the seat. I tried to fix that by putting a gel pad in underneath it, but Unfortunately, that just made it worse and exacerbated the pressure point issue. So I've taken that out, and now the seat actually feels better than it did then, but still, it could be better. Which leads me to my next point about the cockpit, and that is the amount of space I've got. I could really do with the seat being an inch, maybe an inch and a half higher, just to give me a little bit more room for the old clothes pegs and the plates of meat at the bottom there, because I am a little bit scrunched up, a little bit more than I'd like. Now, if you remember, I said earlier on I did have the adjustable LSL foot pegs, which lowered the foot peg height by about 25 to 30 millimeters, but the problem was they made it more uncomfortable for me because my feet were further outwards and I had to twist my feet and my knees in to get the brake, to get the gear lever, which ended up causing even more trouble than just having scrunched up knees. So I'm back to stock peg height with a slightly lower than stock actual peg, so I've got a tiny bit more room, but I would like more. I think for the future maybe that would be a calling for some rear sets, but they are very expensive, and in Germany they have to be TÜV certified, so that's gonna have to wait till I've got a proper stack of rainy day cash that I just wanna on something not so important. Hey, my knees, after a couple of hours they start to feel a little bit cramped, but I think after a couple of hours of sitting in the same position on any bike, you're going to start to feel that. And again, touring in Switzerland, I had no real problems. Tell you what though, I've never done a first gear power wheelie on this bike before, so I think that air filter has helped a little bit. But anyway, yeah, in Switzerland, no comfort issues really, except for, as I said, the wrists. But that's been fixed. And also, while I was in the twisties, the seat wasn't really that much of an issue because I was constantly on the pegs, jumping around on the bike and putting all the weight through my thighs rather than through my arse, and I wasn't really thinking about the bent up knees. The only time I've really noticed this bike become uncomfortable is on long motorway miles. Long stretches on the motorway with this bike do get pretty tiring quite quickly. Obviously with this tiny little screen you're limited by the amount of wind protection you've got, so on the motorway I find that anything over 130 kilometers an hour or 80 miles an hour is just punishing. It's hard work and it's exhausting, and it isn't worth the time that you save by getting there quicker because you just broke them when you do get there. That said, I think the advantages to having a naked bike far outweigh this disadvantage. The biggest one is, since I upgraded from the Versys to this bike, my suffering and woes to do with buffeting and wind noise just went away, just overnight disappeared. Because all of that buffeting, all of that dirty air that was constantly hitting me in the face was caused by the fairing and by the screen. Now obviously I don't have a fairing and a screen now, and this screen probably blocks the wind to about nipple height, I'd say, so nowhere near the head. And because of that, it means all the wind that hits me in the face now is good, clean air. So that means although there's more of it, it's all heading in the same direction, and it just whips cleanly past your helmet and around your shoulders and everything. I mean, it's hard work at high speed, but the ride is far quieter because there's just no turbulence. And as a result, I have no intention in trading back to a faired bike anytime soon. Another strong advantage is because all of that wind is hitting you in the face and in the chest, it reminds you far quicker just how fast you are going. Which, when you bear in mind that this bike has got 150 horsepower on paper, probably about 135 at the back wheel, that reminder is a very good way for me to keep my license for just that little bit longer. Plus, let's be honest, naked bikes look the coolest anyway, don't they? So, anything else on the aspect of comfort? I don't think so. So what else can we talk about as we ride through the seaside town of Eckenförde? What about running the bike? Well, in terms of fuel costs, I couldn't honestly say I've got any real complaints. To be completely frank, I expected far worse. On average, I get somewhere between 250 and 300 kilometers on a tank. Can't think off the top of my head how much that is in miles, but I'll splash it on the screen for you. And just to further back that up, today I've done 171, well, let's just call that 172 kilometers, and I've still got half a tank of fuel left. Now, I've heard of a lot of people saying that their fuel light comes on at 100 miles, so about 160 kilometers. But obviously there's a lot of factors at play. Some people have had their ECUs flashed and don't know about it. Some people have had their ECUs flashed badly and they do know about it. Some people just ride everywhere at 12,000 RPM on the back wheel and blast all of their fuel out the back. But I honestly cannot complain. Coming back to touring in Switzerland last year, the tank range was never really a problem, and I was always needing to fuel up, obviously a little bit before Smokey Bar with his 600cc bike, but not a huge amount. It wasn't like he was always half full as I needed to top up again, which I imagine is exactly what the case would be if I had an MT10. And then continuing with running costs, insurance, this is probably a bit useless for a lot of you because I live in Germany, so things are a little different here. But initially it was a bit of a shock, to be fair. As I upgraded from the Versys 650 to this bike, I called my then insurance provider, told them what I was doing, and they wanted my premium to go up from 350 euros to 1,700, which I'm not going to lie, made me consider not buying the bike. It was exorbitant and just unmanageable. But I did a bit of phoning around, well, a bit of online shopping around. Who even phones insurance companies anymore, right? And I managed to get my insurance down to 600 euros for the year, which for a 150 brake horsepower bike isn't really all that bad. It's still pretty lumpy, but you don't get performance for nothing. Tax, I'm sorry, I have absolutely no idea what that would cost in the UK. I think it would be about £75, but that is just literally a stab in the dark. Here in Germany, I think I pay about 50 to 60 euros a year. As for parts, upgrades, spares, I haven't had any tremendously horrible surprises, to be honest. I mean, the tyres are obviously a bit more expensive than I was used to, simply because the Versys had a 160 rear tyre, this one's got a 190 rear tyre, so it's quite simply just a lot more rubber. But the tyres that I was very kindly given by Michelin, the Road 5s, for a pair of those, I think they should have cost around about 250 euros. But thankfully, because the bike is quite old, there are lots of aftermarket parts, aftermarket alternatives to the OEM parts, so I haven't found anything to be so super expensive that it's unmanageable. Except, of course, for one matter that I will very briefly touch on, brought to my attention by one of you guys, so thanks very much for the heads up there, and that is the matter of the rotor out of the generator. The original part has magnets which are bonded to the inside of the rotating piece, and this is what generates the electricity that powers your headlights, all of your controls, your indicators, everything that needs electricity. And those magnets have been known to let go of the piece that they're bonded onto, jump into each other's loving arms and destroy the generator. And later in the production run of this bike, Yamaha actually created a rotor that had the magnets encased inside the rotating piece, and obviously that means the magnets can't get away. But from reading through the forums, allegedly it's a bit of a ticking time bomb if you've got an FZ1 as to when the magnets are going to let go in your rotor. Not if, but when. You know, I think that's a little bit doomsday and drastic. I'm sure there are people who have hundreds of thousands of miles on their FZ1s that haven't had the rotor problem. But in any case, that's something I'm going to look at, and sadly the rotor does cost 300 euros as the cheapest I can find. So that's a bit punchy, but then at the same time, the costs of having to fix that problem when it explodes and destroys itself in the middle of a tour at the top of a mountain, there's swings and roundabouts, isn't it? But yeah, otherwise, standard stuff. Air filter you can get for like 15 euros, clutch cable you can get for 25. And again, because the bike is quite old, there's lots that have been broken. I mean by breakers yards, not like broken. So on the used market, there are shed loads of spare parts. So if anything ever goes wrong with your bike, it's relatively easy to get a piece for it. Again, without breaking the bank. I've even seen crazy things on eBay, like a complete engine for 400 euros. And then as far as servicing costs, I'm afraid I can't really help you because I do it myself, so obviously the only cost is my time. Although I would say that I found, on the whole, working on the bike isn't so crazily difficult. It's not like a V-twin where one of the cylinders is buried deep underneath the seat and you have to pull everything apart to get to it. But at the same time, because it's a straight four, everything is here in the middle. And that means that pretty much every job you need to do means you have to take the tank off, which also means you have to take the tank fairing off. That means taking the tank off is something that I've now done approximately 1,000 times. What else on the subject of parts? I suppose upgradability. What can you do to the bike? How can you make it better? How can you make it more personal? How can you make it suit you better? I think that's another area where a bike like this, it's a real benefit that it's been around for a few years, because it means for a start a lot of other people have found out what the problems are, like the rotor I told you about, and also it means that companies have had time to develop parts for them. You can of course replace your seat with something better shaped, better padded. Aftermarket seats, contrary to what I said earlier on though, do seem to be quite expensive. They seem to start about 300 euros. You can fit extra bars, although as you will see if you watch my video where I change the bars, that is a bit of a ball ache on this bike. There are many various screens available. You can get carbon fibre panels like I've got. You can of course change your mirrors for something a bit more stylish, a bit more functional than the horrible chrome things that were on it when I got it. You can of course choose from probably hundreds of various aftermarket cans for that warp, crack and popple effect. There's that horrible deceleration cut there again. just to reiterate what I said earlier on, I love the handling of this bike. For a 13-year-old bike, it's just so precise. Goes exactly where I want it to. Stays completely composed throughout, despite me throwing my weight around on top of it. But yeah, back to upgradability. Air filter, there are a wealth of choices for that, as well as the stock obvious. You can get yourself from the aftermarket shelf, one from K&N, BMC, DNA, even high flow. So you've got a lot of choices at various cost points. You can upgrade the suspension. You can get yourself progressive springs for the forks. You can get yourself better damped and more controllable shocks for the back, all from several various brands. So upgradability of this bike is really pretty good. What else on the upgradability side? Obviously LED indicators is a very easy upgrade. Tail tidy is a nice one to tidy up the tail. And then the booster plug, as I've said a few times, a relatively cheap upgrade, far cheaper than a power commander, and it does definitely smooth out those small throttle movements at the low end. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned already, it does nothing for that deceleration cut, but the only thing that will is, of course, the next potential upgrade, an ECU flash with which you can deactivate the valve in your exhaust pipe, the X-up valve. You can disable the deceleration cut. You can remove the timing retardation, which is apparently on first and second gears, which limits the power. Now, on the subject of power, I think this is something that actually makes this bike both terrifyingly scary and also very accessible, and that is the fact that in first gear you can give it full pelt and the front end only begins to very lightly skip off of the floor. Whereas if you were to try that on something like, say, the MT10 with traction control turned off, because this bike has no traction control, I can pretty much guarantee that you're going to end up on your back staring at the sky wondering how long it's going to take to put out the flames around the blazing inferno that used to be your bike 150 yards up the road. A lot of that difference is because the wheelbase of the FZ1 is a lot longer than the wheelbase of the MT10, so the power is being pushed from a lot further back. It means there's less leverage over the front wheel to instigate the wheelie madness. Also, as I already touched upon very briefly, the FZ1 has retardation in the first and second gears, which means you're not getting full power. And also, just generally, the torque and the power curves of the FZ1 start relatively sedately. So whereas on a lot of big crazy twins like the KTM 1290 or bonkers four cylinders like the S1000 or the Yamaha MT10, the torque comes on a lot earlier and a lot fatter. Makes the bike a little bit intimidating if it's your first foray into the litre capacity area. The FZ1, being a little softer at the low end of the rev range, gives you that time to get into the fact that you've got a lot more power at your hands. And if you don't want to get up the revs up to the point where the rocket actually gets lit and pushes you forwards into the future before you really wanted it, then you don't have to. You can get used to it at your own pace, warm yourself into the power, which is exactly what I've done. I mean, jumping from a 64 horsepower bike up to a 150 horsepower bike was a hell of a hike. So the fact that all of that power and all of that grunt doesn't just punch you in the back as soon as you touch the throttle makes the bike a lot more accessible. Fighting against that, of course, is the horrible snatchy throttle, which means that when you're tanked over in a corner at about 5,000 RPM and you want to gently come onto the throttle, you can't, because you just get digital no throttle, go, there's your power, which can unsettle you a bit. So there are arguments against my idea that this is an accessible litre bike. But anyway, back to the accessibility of it. You buy the bike, you've got the power available if you want it when you open up the taps fully. You get the smoothness of this wonderful old R1 engine. You can do all the extra upgrades with fancy panels, quick shifter, upgrade your suspension, nice mirrors, get yourself a little screen, change your brake lines. And then once you've done all that, in that time you've probably got used to the power and you're starting to think, yeah, well, the torque's a little bit thin at the low end. So that's when you've got options to throw a little bit of money at your bike and increase the performance massively. So all of this means that it's a bike that you can buy stock, get used to it, and then gradually improve the bike as you grow with the performance. So it makes it an incredibly versatile bike. Coupled with the fact that they can be had for such little money, it makes it hard to justify the cost of buying a brand new bike when, as I found out in my test ride of the MT10 and the Suzuki GSX S1000 a couple of weeks ago, they're good. They've got a lot more bells and whistles and toys and things, but if 5 mapping modes and electronically adjustable suspension and all that kind of gadgety nonsense isn't for you, it's hard to justify spending the money over something like this, especially when this cost me a quarter of the price of the MT10 SP or a third of the price of the standard MT10. It's bonkers to imagine that I'm getting the same satisfaction out of a bike so much older and so much cheaper. So ultimately, for very little investment, I've got myself an absolute belter of a bike that I am ultimately very, very happy with. It has fantastic handling, plenty of power for my needs at least, agility without end, and just smiles per €1,000. I'm getting far more out of this than I would out of a new bike, I think. So I think pretty much I've covered everything. I know that you're probably screaming at the screen now, telling me the one thing you wanted to know that I haven't mentioned. If that is the case, give me a shout in the comments and I will try to give you an answer to your question if it's something I know anything about. But yeah, a year and a half with the FZ1 and ultimately I'm still really happy. What have I got on the list yet to change? Quite a lot less than when I started actually. I would quite like to change the seat at some point. I also would very much like to get the ECU reflashed and get all these restrictions taken off, because they're the one thing about the performance aspect of this bike that still get on my... So I hate that D-cell cut. I would quite like to get rid of the passenger seat because Mrs. Mancam doesn't come on the bike, so there's no need for it. And once I've done that, I could get rid of the pegs as well. The only problem with that is that this has to be recorded in the paperwork of the bike in Germany, and that costs time and that costs money, which at the moment I just don't have to spare on what would ultimately be a cosmetic change. I would very much like to get a set of rear sets so that I have more adjustment with the foot peg position, move them down a little bit, move them rearwards a little bit. But again, that's a very expensive upgrade, which is going to have to wait for that lottery win moment. But ultimately, at the moment, I'm very happy with it. It's incredibly enjoyable to ride. It has proven to be an incredibly versatile bike, which, yes, it's not perfect, but there is lots that can be done to make it very, very damn close. And that pretty much brings us to the end of this quite probably very long video. I'm sorry about the length, but I'm not regretful of the content. That's what she said. I think things got a bit rambly there at moments, but if there's anything worth rambling about, it's old motorbikes, isn't it? So that's my hopefully complete roundup of my experience of first year of ownership of the Yamaha FZ1. It's a purchase that I'm very happy I made, and mostly the bike has fully lived up to expectations. As for a year from now, well, we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to see if I finally do get the fueling issues ironed out, see if I can find any more upgrades, changes, improvements that can maybe be made to further increase my enjoyment from this incredibly reasonably priced, immensely underrated bike. So, I would like to thank you very much for watching. If you're considering getting yourself an FZ1, hopefully this has helped in some way. If it has, please do be sure to give the video a thumbs up. If it hasn't, give it a thumbs down. And if you're not already, do hit the subscribe button and then tick the little bell thing just to make sure that you keep up to date with more videos like this about everything to do with motorbikes. In the meantime, keep yours shiny, and I will see you out there. Ta-ra!